If anyone had told me last year that a simple neighborhood barbecue could shatter the comfortable monotony of suburban life, I would have laughed. Yet here I was, flipping burgers and tossing fake smiles while a knot of unease twisted tighter and tighter in my stomach. It all started with a look, one lingering glance between my husband, Mark, and our next-door neighbor, Sarah. Now, I'm not the jealous type. I've been married to Mark for 10 years, and we've weathered our share of storms. But there was something in that look, something that made my skin prickle and my mind race with questions I wasn't ready to ask. The evening dragged on with the usual banal chatter, kids running around, and the scent of overcooked meat hanging in the air. I watched Mark and Sarah out of the corner of my eye, trying to convince myself that the laughter they shared was harmless, that the glances were nothing more than neighborly camaraderie. But the gnawing doubt wouldn't let go. That night, after the barbecue wound down and we tucked our boys into bed, I found myself wide awake. Maybe it was the overcooked burgers sitting heavy in my stomach, or perhaps it was the memory of that damn look. Whatever it was, it had me staring at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. Instead, I heard voices, hushed, urgent whispers, right outside our bedroom window. Sliding out of bed as quietly as possible, I crept over to the window and peeked through the blinds. There they were, Mark and Sarah, their heads close together, the dim glow of the streetlight casting eerie shadows across their faces. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of anxiety and anger. What the hell were they talking about at this hour? The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was all in my head. But every time I saw Sarah, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. Later that day, I went over to help her move a planter. Simple enough, right? Except when her hand brushed against mine, I felt a spark. No, not just a spark, an electric jolt that shot through me, leaving me breathless. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned, my mind reeling. "Thanks for the help, Claire," Sarah said, her smile just a little too knowing. "Yeah, no problem," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Sarah invited me to a girls' night at her place. Part of me wanted to decline, to avoid her and the unsettling feelings she stirred up. But another part of me, the curious part, couldn't resist. Maybe I wanted answers, maybe I wanted to confront this head on, or maybe I just wanted to see if my fears were founded. That evening, I found myself sitting in Sarah's living room, a glass of wine in hand. The conversation started innocently enough, work, kids, the usual suburban banter. But as the wine flowed, Sarah's mask began to slip. She started sharing intimate details about her marriage, her dissatisfaction, her yearning for something more. I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, all the while feeling that knot in my stomach morph into a cold, hard lump. And then she dropped the bombshell. "You know, Claire," she said, her voice slurring slightly, "I've always found Mark attractive." I nearly choked on my wine. Feigning shock, I laughed it off, but inside, a cold rage was building, mixing with a sick curiosity. The night wore on, and the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. By the time we were on our fourth, maybe fifth, glass of wine, the room was spinning, and my defenses were down. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, Sarah leaned in and kissed me. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a deep, lingering kiss that left me frozen in place. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, anger, confusion, and yes, an undeniable spark of curiosity. What the hell was happening? I pulled back, my heart pounding, 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Sarah just smiled, a mysterious, almost triumphant look in her eyes. As I stumbled home that night, the events of the evening replayed in my mind like a twisted movie. The look, the whispers, the touch, the kiss. What did it all mean? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? One thing was certain. Life in our sleepy suburban neighborhood would never be the same again. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be sneaking around like a character in a soap opera, I'd have laughed in their face. Yet here I was, trying to keep my composure while Mark and Sarah exchanged increasingly flirtatious glances right under my nose. Every time they spoke, I felt like I was on the brink of an emotional meltdown. Days passed in a haze of unspoken tension. Mark and Sarah's interactions seemed to multiply, each one more charged than the last. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I found myself scrutinizing every move they made, every word they said, searching for evidence of something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. One afternoon, the tension reached a boiling point. Mark was out, running some errands, and I was trying to distract myself with a book that I wasn't really reading. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Can you come over for a sec? Need help with something in the garage." My heart raced. What now? I told myself it was probably nothing, just an innocent request. But deep down, I knew better. I found Sarah in her garage, standing by a cluttered workbench. The space was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, dusty window high on the wall. As soon as I stepped inside, she closed the door behind me, shutting out the world. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low and smooth. "I needed someone I can trust." Trust. The word felt like a dagger. Before I could respond, she was on me, her lips crashing against mine with a fierceness that left me breathless. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push her away, but my body betrayed me, responding to her touch with a fervor I didn't know I had. We stumbled against the workbench, knocking over tools and jars of nails. Her hands roamed over my body, exploring with a desperate intensity. I matched her pace, my own hands finding their way under her shirt, our breaths mingling in the small, confined space. It was madness, pure and simple. A feverish, all-consuming madness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally pulled apart, both of us gasping for air. We collapsed onto an old couch in the corner of the garage, our bodies tangled together. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? The guilt and excitement swirled together, making it hard to think straight. This can't happen again, I said, my voice trembling. Even as I spoke the words, I knew they were a lie. A bond had formed between us in that moment, a bond forged in secrecy and shared desire. Sarah just nodded, her eyes dark and unreadable. "I know," she whispered, but there was something in her tone that told me she wasn't entirely convinced either. I left the garage in a daze, my emotions a chaotic storm. The betrayal, the thrill, the fear of discovery, it was all too much. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, spiraling deeper into a situation I couldn't control. When Mark came home later that evening, I plastered a smile on my face, playing the role of the dutiful wife. He had no idea, of course. How could he? I had become an expert at hiding my true feelings, at pretending everything was perfectly normal. But inside, I was a mess. Every time he touched me, every time he spoke, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, the way she felt, the way she tasted. It was like an addiction, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew things would never be the same. The spark had ignited a fire, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. And I was powerless to stop it. I always thought living a double life was the stuff of bad spy movies and cheap romance novels. Yet here I was, juggling the roles of devoted wife and secret lover like some twisted circus act. The thrill of our secret meetings, the adrenaline rush of stolen moments, it was intoxicating, and I was hooked. Sarah and I became experts at sneaking around. We'd meet in her garage, in the park, even in the back corner of a little cafe where no one knew us. Each encounter was more intense, more daring. Our inhibitions melted away, replaced by a burning need that neither of us could deny. "Claire, can you come over? Need your help with something." She'd text, and I'd be out the door in minutes, the thrill of our rendezvous making my heart race. We'd barely speak when I arrived, our bodies taking over where words failed. The passion between us was raw, unfiltered, and increasingly risky. I started leading a double life, playing the part of the perfect wife while indulging in this secret affair. It wasn't just about the sex, though that was incredible, it was about the way Sarah made me feel. Alive, desired, like a completely different person. It was addictive. With each secret meeting, our desires grew bolder. We pushed boundaries I never knew I had, exploring fantasies and taboos. One night, in a fit of post-coital euphoria, Sarah confessed a fantasy involving all three of us, her, me, and Mark. The idea was as thrilling as it was terrifying. I laughed it off, but the thought lingered in my mind, a dangerous temptation. Living this double life was exhausting. I'd come home to Mark, plaster a smile on my face, and pretend everything was normal. But subtle changes started creeping in. A newfound confidence, an occasional slip-up in my alibi. Mark wasn't oblivious, he began to notice. "You're different lately," he'd say, a mix of curiosity and suspicion in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I'd reply, my heart pounding. "Just busy, I guess." But the lies were piling up, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came crashing down. One evening, after a particularly intense rendezvous with Sarah, I came home late. Mark was waiting for me, his expression a mix of worry and anger. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Just out with friends," I lied, my stomach knotting. "Lost track of time." He studied me, his eyes searching for the truth. "Claire, I've noticed things. You've been distant, secretive. What's going on?" Panic surged through me. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. I tried to muster a convincing lie, but the words wouldn't come. The hurt in his eyes was like a knife to my heart. "Mark, I began, but my voice faltered. He stepped closer, his face a mask of pain and confusion. "Are you seeing someone else?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the guilt was too much. The weight of my deceit, the betrayal, it all came crashing down on me. "Mark, I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I never meant for this to happen." His expression shifted from suspicion to heartbreak. "Who is it?" I hesitated, the truth catching in my throat. "It's Sarah." The look of shock and betrayal on his face was almost unbearable. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair, trying to process what I'd just confessed. "I need to think," he said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "I need to be alone." He walked out, leaving me standing there, my world unraveling. The thrill of the affair, the excitement of the secret meetings, it all seemed so hollow now. The fallout had begun, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. "Claire, we need to talk." Mark's voice cut through the tension in the room like a knife. There was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. I had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the foundation of our life together cracking. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but my mouth was dry as sand. "Where have you been? Who have you been seeing?" The questions were sharp, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. "I told you, I was out with friends," I said, my voice trembling. It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. "Stop lying to me, Claire," he shouted, his frustration boiling over. "I found this on your phone." He thrust my phone towards me, the screen glowing with a text message from Sarah. It was a message I hadn't even seen yet, a message that spelled out everything in explicit detail. "Missed you already. Can't wait for our next meeting. XOXO, Sarah." My heart sank. There was no way out now. Cornered and defeated, I felt the walls closing in. The truth was out, and there was no denying it any longer. I'm sorry, Mark," I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I've been seeing Sarah. We've been having an affair." The look on his face was one of utter devastation. His trust shattered, his heart broken. It was like watching the light drain from his eyes, leaving only pain and betrayal behind. "How could you do this to me? To us?" he asked, his voice cracking. "With Sarah, of all people? Our neighbor?" "I never meant for it to happen," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It just did." "That's not good enough, Claire," he said, shaking his head. "We made promises to each other. We built a life together. And you threw it all away for what? For her?" His words cut deep, but I felt a spark of anger rising within me. "It's not all on me, Mark," I shot back. "You've been distant, neglectful. I felt invisible in this marriage. You never even noticed when I needed you." "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me," he said, his eyes blazing. "You made the choice to cheat. You broke the vows, not me." We stood there, hurling accusations and blame at each other, the air thick with anger and hurt. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing there was no way to stop it. Finally, Mark's anger seemed to simmer down, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice flat. "You're going to end it with Sarah. Right now, or we're done. You need to choose, Claire." The ultimatum hung in the air, a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. My mind raced, torn between my love for Mark and the intoxicating desire I felt for Sarah. It felt like I was being pulled in two different directions, the weight of the decision crushing me. I need time to think, I said, my voice barely audible. No, you need to decide, he said firmly. Right now. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the gravity of the situation. There was no easy way out, no simple answer. I was standing at a crossroads, forced to choose between the life I had built and the dangerous allure of the unknown. Taking a deep breath, I looked into Mark's eyes, seeing the pain and betrayal etched into his features. I'll end it, I said finally, my voice breaking. I'll end it with Sarah. Mark nodded, but the hurt in his eyes didn't fade. You'd better mean it, Claire, he said quietly. Because if you don't, there won't be any coming back from this. As he walked away, I felt a hollow emptiness settle in my chest. The choice had been made, but the consequences were just beginning. The thrill of the affair, the excitement of the secret meetings, it all seemed so hollow now. The fallout had begun, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. Ever had one of those moments where you know everything is about to go spectacularly wrong, but you're powerless to stop it? Yeah, that was me, standing in our living room as Mark's face contorted with fury. It felt like watching a storm roll in, knowing you'd left all the windows open. Mark's eruption was like a volcano, sudden and explosive. How could you do this to us? He yelled, his voice reverberating off the walls. He grabbed the nearest thing, a picture frame, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the glass splintering into a million tiny pieces. Just like our marriage, I thought bitterly, one jagged shard for each broken promise. You lied to me, he continued, pacing like a caged animal. Every single day, you looked me in the eye and lied. His fists clenched and unclenched, the veins in his neck bulging with suppressed rage. In a moment of blind fury, he lunged at me, shoving me against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of me, his hands gripping my arms so tightly I knew there'd be bruises. For a second, pure terror flooded through me. This wasn't my Mark, the man I married. This was someone else entirely, consumed by rage and hurt. I'm sorry, Mark, please. I cried, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for it to get this far. I promise, it's over. I'll do anything to make it right. He released me abruptly, as if my touch burned him, and turned away. You can't just erase this, Claire, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You can't just make this go away. That night was one of the longest of my life. Mark stormed off to the guest room, slamming the door behind him. I crawled into our bed, the emptiness beside me a stark reminder of the chasm that had opened up between us. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with a million what-ifs and could-have-beens. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hurt in Mark's eyes, felt the weight of my betrayal crushing me. The next morning was nothing short of awkward. We moved around each other in the kitchen like strangers, avoiding eye contact, barely speaking. The tension was so thick it felt like walking through molasses. I made coffee, the mundane task offering a brief respite from the chaos of my thoughts. Coffee? I asked, holding out a cup. He didn't even look at me, just nodded curtly and took the cup, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. It felt like an electric shock, a painful reminder of the intimacy we once shared. Mark refused to speak to me, communicating only through curt nods and monosyllabic grunts. It was like living with a ghost, the shell of my husband haunting the rooms we once filled with laughter and love. Every silent meal, every night spent apart, it was like another nail in the coffin of our crumbling marriage. I tried to engage him, to bridge the gap, but every attempt was met with a wall of silence. The unspoken accusations, the simmering resentment, it was all too much. Our once loving marriage now hung by a thread, the trust and intimacy replaced by suspicion and bitterness. I could feel it slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. Every day was a struggle, each moment a reminder of what I'd lost. The laughter, the shared dreams, the little moments of connection, they were all gone, replaced by this cold, unyielding distance. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way back. The spark that once ignited our love had been extinguished, leaving only ashes in its wake. I knew I had to face the consequences of my actions, but the reality was so much harsher than I'd ever imagined. The fallout was complete, and I was left standing in the wreckage of our life, wondering if there was any way to rebuild what we'd lost. Or if it was all gone forever, a casualty of my own selfish desires. You know things are bad when family members start showing up unannounced. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where you'd usually find Mark and me lounging in the living room, sipping coffee and reading. Instead, we were living in a tension-filled silence that could rival a Hitchcock movie. So when the doorbell rang and I opened it to find David, Mark's older brother, standing there, I wasn't surprised. David always had this uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Claire," he said, giving me a look that was a mix of concern and something harder to pin down. "Is Mark home?" I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Mark appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of weariness and anger. "David," he said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" David glanced at me, then back at Mark. "We need to talk, privately." They disappeared into Mark's office, the door closing with a finality that left me feeling more isolated than ever. I could only imagine the conversation happening behind those closed doors. Mark, spilling everything about my betrayal, about Sarah. David, offering his sage advice and unwavering support. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the crisp morning air hitting my face like a slap. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing. What was David saying? What would Mark do? Hours later, I returned home, the dread pooling in my stomach. I found Mark and David in the kitchen, deep in conversation. They fell silent as I entered, the tension palpable. David's expression was unreadable, but Mark's was a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. David stood up, clearing his throat. "Claire, we need to resolve this," he said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Mark's told me everything." "Everything?" I echoed, my voice small. "Yes," David replied, his eyes boring into mine. "You've put him in an impossible situation. But we can't ignore that there are children involved, a family at stake." I nodded, feeling the weight of my actions pressing down on me. Later that evening, when Mark was out, David confronted me again. "Claire, I need to know if you're serious about ending things with Sarah. Mark deserves better than this." "I know," I whispered, feeling the tears well up. "I know he does. I've ended it, or at least, I tried." "Tried isn't good enough," David said sharply. "Sarah needs to understand that it's over." The next day, David took matters into his own hands. He met with Sarah, a secret rendezvous that I only learned about later. He didn't mince words, demanding that she end the affair and stay away from our family. Sarah, being Sarah, refused. Defiantly, she declared her love for me, insisting that she wasn't going to back down. "I love her, David. You can't just tell me to disappear." David's response was icy. "If you don't end this, there will be consequences. I'll make sure of it." The tension escalated, a dangerous game of chicken where neither side was willing to swerve. David's threats hung in the air, a dark promise of retribution. Sarah's stubbornness only fueled the fire, her refusal to back down creating a volatile mix. Mark sensed the conflict, the undercurrents of aggression that seeped into every interaction. The house felt like a battleground, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Conversations were stilted, every word weighed with double meaning. One night, after another strained dinner, Mark finally broke the silence. "Claire, I need to know where we stand. Are you with me, or are you still pining for Sarah?" I looked into his eyes, seeing the pain and uncertainty. "Mark, I'm with you. I want to make this right. But it's not that simple." "Then make it simple," he said, his voice breaking. "Choose us. Choose our family." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I choose you, Mark. I choose our family." But even as I said the words, I knew the path ahead was fraught with challenges. The fallout from the affair had created a chasm, one that would take time, patience, and a lot of effort to bridge. David's involvement had only escalated the conflict, turning our personal struggle into a volatile and dangerous environment. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war was just beginning. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that bad decisions love company. So when Mark suggested we go to a dinner party at Sarah and her husband's house, my first thought was, sure, why not? What's one more bad decision in the grand scheme of things? It seemed like a terrible idea, but part of me felt it was an opportunity to prove I'd moved on. Or at least, that's what I told myself. We arrived at Sarah's house, the same house that had become the backdrop for our illicit rendezvous. The tension was palpable from the moment we walked through the door. Forced smiles and awkward silences punctuated the evening, making the air thick with unspoken words. Sarah's husband, blissfully ignorant, played the perfect host, while Mark and I tried to keep up the facade of a happy couple. I tried to avoid looking at Sarah, but it was impossible. Our eyes met across the room, a silent communication that spoke volumes. It was a dangerous game we were playing, one filled with forbidden desires and shared secrets. Each glance was a reminder of what we had, and what we could lose. As the night wore on, the wine flowed freely. With each glass, the invisible barriers that kept our impulses in check began to crumble. Sarah and I grew bolder, our flirtations less subtle. A brush of the hand here, a lingering look there. It was reckless, but the alcohol dulled my sense of danger, filling me with a false sense of courage. Then it happened. In a moment of sheer madness, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a mixture of defiance and desire. The room seemed to freeze, the air heavy with anticipation. For a split second, I was lost in her gaze, the world around us fading into the background. But reality came crashing back when I felt Mark's eyes on us. His face contorted with rage and humiliation, the betrayal cutting deeper than any knife. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. The room erupted into chaos. Guests stared in shock, their murmurs rising in a crescendo of disbelief. Mark stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "So this is it, huh? You couldn't keep it in your pants for one night?" Sarah's husband looked bewildered, glancing between us with a growing understanding of the situation. "What is he talking about, Sarah?" Sarah, ever the cool one under pressure, tried to play it off. "Nothing, it's nothing, everyone just calm down." But Mark wasn't having it. "Nothing, nothing?" he shouted. I saw you too. This has been going on for months." His voice broke, the pain evident in every word. I wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear and escape the mess I'd created. But there was no escaping now. "Mark, please," I tried, my voice weak and trembling. "Let's just talk about this." "Talk about this?" he echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's left to talk about? You've already said enough." The room fell silent again, the tension unbearable. Sarah's husband, looking like he'd been punched in the gut, turned to her. "Is it true?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. The betrayal was complete, the facade shattered. There was no going back. Mark took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "We're done, Claire. This," he gestured between us, "is over. You've made your choice." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, my world collapsing around me. Sarah's husband followed suit, dragging her away from me, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. I was left alone in the aftermath, the whispers of the guests swirling around me like a storm. The fallout was complete, the reality of my actions hitting me harder than ever. The thrill of the affair, the excitement of the secret meetings, it all seemed so pointless now. As I stumbled out of the house, the cold night air hitting my face, I realized the magnitude of my mistakes. I had lost everything, my husband, my stability, my sense of self. And all for a fleeting moment of passion that had left nothing but destruction in its wake. There was no escaping the consequences now. I was left to face the ruins of my life, wondering if there was any way to rebuild, or if I was destined to live in the shadow of my own betrayal.